Hello, my name is Isabel Potworowski, and I teach at the University of Cincinnati in the School of Architecture and Interior Design. This paper is titled Orientation and Place in Christian Sacred Architecture Between Place-boundedness and Placelessness. This research emerged from my doctoral thesis about the spiritual atmospheres in Peter Zumthor's architecture. And one of my conclusions was that the spiritual atmospheres in his buildings derive to a great extent from their context. They amplify the existing atmosphere of their place. However, when testing how applicable my conclusions might be beyond Zumthor's work, it seemed to me that in many cases, the relation between spiritual atmospheres and the pre-existing qualities of place was not as strong, or at least not as explicit. And yet, a sacred quality was still clearly there. And I found this to be especially the case for large, classically designed churches. The connection to the surroundings is not that strong, yet I found these spaces to have a sacred atmosphere and strong orienting capacity, both intellectually and spiritually. And my interest about the role of place and the spiritual orienting capacity of churches was further provoked by the late Chinese American geographer Yifu Tuan, who proposed that religions evolve from worldly place-bound practices to rational, abstract, placeless practices, and that the latter are a sign of enlightenment. He points out that Christians are pilgrims with a home that is not on this earth. God is everywhere and nowhere, he writes, an idea that he relates to Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman, as narrated in the Gospel of John. Jesus tells this woman that the time is coming and is now here when true worship will not take place on the holy mountain or at the temple in Jerusalem, but in spirit and truth. What then is the role of place in how churches orient us? The historical trend from place to placelessness that Tuan describes does correspond to the history of the Judeo-Christian religion. But according to church teaching, and as the late Pope Benedict XVI has explained, worship that is only in spirit and truth will only come at the end of time. When the Israelites were traveling in the desert, God gave them precise instructions for building a movable tabernacle, and he dwelt in it, guiding them as a pillar of cloud. God filled the temple of Solomon as a cloud, dwelling among his people. After the second temple was built, the prophet Isaiah records God saying, "Heaven is my throne and earth my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me, and what is my resting place?" The worship in spirit and truth begins when Jesus ascends into heaven and sends down the Holy Spirit, the Advocate, marking the beginning of the age of the Church. However, the age of the Church, which includes the present time, has been interpreted by the Church Fathers as an image of the fullness to come. And the late Pope Benedict, as others before him, described this time as already and not yet, in which the transition from temple sacrifice to universal worship in spirit and truth is not yet fulfilled. We still need earthly signs as mediators of heavenly realities. The church as image is the subject of attention. Between being in history and transcending history, being visible in society while also being a spiritual community, human yet divine, being present in the world but as a pilgrim towards another world, an earthly tabernacle but also a sanctuary of God, immanent and transcendent, place-bound and placeless. And so my main question is, how is this tension reflected in the design of churches? I'll attempt a response to this question in three layers, exploring the tension between place-boundedness and placelessness in first, the location or siting of churches, second, in how their exterior appearance relates to their place, and third, in the connection between the interior and the surroundings. In terms of location, on the place-bound end of the spectrum, is churches built on locations of events of sacred history and of miracles, orienting us towards the divine intervention that took place there. Religious studies scholar Lindsay Jones, in his description of ritual architectural events, describes how buildings orient and invite people to a dialogue. This includes architectural expressions of hierophany or an earthly manifestation of the sacred, a concept that he takes from Mircea Eliade, including intrinsically powerful places and natural features, and places that are discovered rather than created. An example is the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth, home of Mary, where the altar in the crypt bears the inscription Verbum caro hic factum est, or the Word became flesh here. Other places of sacred history include the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Tomb of Christ. And there are also places of miracles, often Marian apparitions, that become places of pilgrimage. Examples are at Lourdes, at Our Lady of Fatima, and in Guadalupe. Other locations that are charged or meaningful are this way because of a historical event, and such places take on a memorial role. One example is the Madonna in the Ruins Chapel in Cologne, on the place or on the footprint of the former St. Columba Church, which was bombed during the Second World War, and a statue of Mary was discovered there almost unscathed. And so the chapel was built on this location to commemorate this. Most churches, however, are built because of community need. And these churches orient insofar as they indicate the presence of a community of believers. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the worship in spirit and in truth of the new covenant is not tied exclusively to any one place. The whole earth is sacred and entrusted to the children of men. Towards the placeless end of the spectrum are mobile places of worship, temporary pavilions that are meant to move elsewhere, or churches on wheels, as was the practice in the southern United States in the early 20th century, to evangelize rural communities. As opposed to the pilgrimage, where the faithful travel to a place of hierophany, here the message of God travels to meet the people. The next layer is the building exterior and its relation to place. On one end of the spectrum are buildings that express the local culture and community, often through traditional architecture rooted in that place. Lindsay Jones writes that through familiar and traditional forms, sacred architecture presents itself as inviting and alluring. The Catechism states that church buildings are not simply gathering places, but signify and make visible the church living in this place, the dwelling of God with men, reconciled and united in Christ. American scholar Dennis McNamara writes that churches therefore have a symbolic role. Every church building is a record of the story of its people, expressing the culture of its community, but also should have a distinct ecclesiastical architecture. That is, it should be recognizable as a church, because every church building is both a sign of the earthly congregation and a community on pilgrimage towards the heavenly Jerusalem. Familiarity can also be expressed in local materials and can express a local community, especially when it was built by them, as was the tile chapel in Ecuador. And there are also contemporary interpretations of traditional forms using local materials. For instance, this church in Norway, inspired by the country's traditional stave churches. Churches based on conventions and precedents from elsewhere can also convey familiarity and authority, orienting towards that which they imitate. Orthodox architect Andrew Gold writes of Christian and especially Byzantine churches as adopting Roman art. For instance, the columns, the marble, gilding, mosaic vaults, frescoes, all of which reflect Rome as authoritative and associated with divine beauty. And he also, in relation to this connection, writes of St. John's vision of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, which describes the city as having the form of a Roman city. It is square-shaped with many gates and walls adorned with precious stones. McNamara writes of the preference for classical architecture because of its symbolism, that is, its meaning-bearing capacity of the conventional forms. For instance, anthropomorphic elements like columns symbolizing the apostles, ornamentation that conveys festivity and hierarchy, and clarity of structural expression, all of which have the capacity to convey theological meaning. Churches that copy significant churches, for instance, the near copies of St. Peter's Basilica, also show connection to that place. And there are examples in the Netherlands and in Côte d'Ivoire. And this connection can also be political, establishing authority. At the other end of the spectrum are churches with a more contemporary and unconventional expression, one that McNamara might call unchurch-like. If they provide orientation, then it is often by contrasting striking forms. The third layer of this framework concerns the interior of buildings. Once they have invited us to enter, what they orient us towards, and by doing so, how they communicate the divine. On one end of the spectrum are churches oriented towards views of surrounding nature. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, on care for our common home, wrote of creation or the natural world as revelatory of the Creator God. At the same time, he writes that nature is not divine, as there is an infinite distance between God and created things. Also emphasizing nature is the eco-theology of Catholic Passionist priest Thomas Berry, which inspired the design of St. Gabriel Church in Toronto by fellow ACSF member, architect Roberto Chiotti, with Larkin Architect. This approach is ecocentric rather than anthropocentric, and the earth is considered as a sacred reality in which everything is interrelated. At St. Gabriel's, the church interior is oriented towards the garden to emphasize that the community gathers to worship within the greater context of God's creation. At Saint François de Molitor Church in Paris, the interior also faces a garden, and Jesuit theologian Bert Dallemans interprets this orientation as a symbol for the heavenly Jerusalem, recalling the Garden of Eden and of heaven. Framing views not of the surroundings but of the sky, these chapels have something in common with church ceilings painted to represent the heavens. But rather than representing, these sacred spaces open onto the infinite distance beyond, an axis mundi, to use the term of Mircea Eliade, connecting the earth below and the heavens above. Connecting even less to place are churches with no views, minimal imagery, only natural light. German Catholic architect Rudolf Schwarz wrote that one cannot represent heaven. We can only suggest what lies beyond. God dwells in the emptiness beyond our world. And he says that it's perhaps best not to make any image at all, only leave emptiness, or a large inaccessible white space. In John Pawson's renovation of St. Moritz Church, the apse is a room of light, and windows are covered with thin slices of onyx, giving a diffused luminescence. This treatment of the space recalls Johanni Palasma's description of natural light as a divine gift. On the far end of the spectrum is what could be understood as tending the most towards the placeless, in the sense of being removed from this world, transporting one to another world. Churches with a strong threshold and imagery of the heavenly Jerusalem. So, contrary to Schwartz, these churches say that heaven can be represented. According to the church document Sacrosanctum Concilium, churches should contain signs and symbols of the supernatural world. By way of foretaste, we share in that heavenly liturgy, which is celebrated in the holy city of Jerusalem, towards which we journey as pilgrims. McNamara writes that the earthly liturgy is a sacramental participation in the liturgy of heaven, which takes place in the heavenly Jerusalem. And that in the time of the image, liturgical art and architecture are vehicles for the revelation of the heavenly reality to come. This framework has been an attempt at making sense of and bringing order to the role of place in Catholic churches, and hopefully contributes to the discussion of place as it relates to sacred space more broadly. Thank you.